All right, so moving right along, we'll take a look at William Butler Yeats, who, like Hardy, like Shaw, lived for a good number of years in the Victorian period and witnessed directly the changes from the Victorian to the modern period. Um, but while Yeats did produce a vast volume of writing during the Victorian period, the works for which he's most famous are the ones he wrote usually in the around the 1920s, and those are also the ones that are distinctly modern. And so those are the poems we're going to focus on. And I think Yeats really provides a good, despite having lived half of his life in the Victorian period, really provides a really good introduction to modernism. His poem, The Second Coming, which is the one we'll study in the lecture, even though I also assigned several others, the first 8 lines of it, I think, really in a nutshell, describe modernism. So he should be helpful in that. Um, he lived in Ireland and England. His family growing up divided their time between Dublin, so the urban capital of Ireland, London, the urban capital of England, and then the Sligo, which is a more rural part of the Irish countryside where his mother was from. So he really has these 3 different perspectives: Irish, English, and then rural, that influenced all of his writing. Yeats is one of the most varied writers. There's not a ton of consistency. As the textbook outlines, he had really 4 different phases throughout his life of writing poetry. And the third phase, the high modern phase, is the one that's really helpful to us. And so his writings varied greatly over his long life, but all 3 of these locations influenced his writing. He was religious by temperament. In other words, he wanted to be religious. He was a very devotional kind of person filled with faith, but he did not believe in Christian. He couldn't buy Christian beliefs, didn't agree with the Bible. So much of his life and much of his poetic career was sought trying to recover his lost religion, is the way the textbook puts it. But he eventually invented his own religion, like Blake. Um, we talked about how Blake developed his own religion in the Romantic period, and the Romantic periods and the modern periods have much in common: the alienation, the isolation, the focus on beauty of language. And oftentimes, as we talked about, a literary movement is a reaction against the previous one, and then kind of goes 2 periods back to the one before the previous one and borrows some from that, which is very much true of modernism and romanticism. Um, and like I mentioned way back, you probably don't remember in the first lecture, Blake was not famous during his lifetime. So it was Yeats's publishing of Blake's poems that brought Blake to critical attention and now made him one of the most famous poets of all time. Um, Blake had a very consistent, thoroughly thought out um, religion that he developed. Yeats just was all over the place in his life. And so there's not one clear articulation of Yeats's religion like there is of Blake's. But they do have that attempt in common to um, pursue faith and pursue spirituality and to use Christianity as a foundation, but then to deviate far from it in developing their own spiritual views. In 1889, Yeats met and fell in love with a beautiful actress and Irish nationalist, Maud Gonne. He proposed to her a number of times. He lived a very long life, so he actually later in life proposed to her daughter when her daughter was of marrying age, but they both rejected all of his proposals. It was a very strange obsession. But he got to know Maud through the Irish nationalist movement, which was very important to his literary career. Um, Yeats, like Joyce, was very ambivalent toward Irish nationalism, but actually got involved in it, whereas Joyce did not. And the way he got involved with it was trying to revive Celtic literature. And so there's a movement in the early 20th century in Ireland called the Celtic Revivalist movement. And this was a movement to go and find um, the ballads, the folk tales, the folklore, the legends of the rural oral culture in Ireland and bring those back, write new plays and poems and novels that incorporated those Irish folk tales. And so Yeats actually wrote a lot of plays based on Irish legends. And he believed that he Irish literature, the reviving of the Celtic literature, could bring together the Protestants and the Catholics, the two sides who disagreed on whether or not to belong to to the to Great Britain. And so he, throughout his life, was in and out of Irish politics, in and out of Irish nationalism. Sometimes really bought into it, other times distanced himself from it because, again, he was all over the place. But he actually served as a senator of the Irish Free State, that newly formed state that was independent from Britain from its founding in 1922 for 6 years through 28. So while it didn't work out with Maud Gonne, he eventually married Georgie Hyde Lees in 1917. He was 52, and they went on to have a number of kids. And she actually was a very good wife to him. I don't know how good of a husband he was to her, but she really put up with all of his intellectualism, all of his imagination, and through her kind of acceptance of his kind of far out there political ideas, he developed a theory, his theory of gyres, which are interpenetrating cones, which I would argue are his greatest political achievement. This is what he incorporated into the poems he wrote in his third phase of writing in the 1920s. And I think this theory and those poems from the 1920s really encapsulate modernism. And so that's what we're going to spend the rest of the lecture talking about. Here are his gyres. So you see two cones that intersect with each other. And what this represents is a view of history that views history as cyclical, that it spins in a circle and it repeats, and of ages, so sets of time periods, and that when one age ends and a new one begins, there's some overlap between the two. So history repeats itself, and when it sets upon repeating itself, the two time periods overlap. That's his theory of gyres, and like I said, I think it really encapsulates modernism. So we're going to tease that out by looking at the coming. Like I said earlier, the second coming, the first stanza, the first 8 lines, I think are 8 of the most brilliant and beautiful lines in poetry. They're absolutely beautiful, but they depict some horrific things. If you just read the words and listen to the sound of them without thinking about their content, they just sound beautiful. But the content depicts something horrific. So again, that's that high modernism, that art for the sake of art's sake, art as a means of grappling with modernity, and beautiful language, but not optimism. And again, like I said, that first stanza, not the second one, the first 8 lines really encapsulate modernism. If someone says to me, define modernism briefly, I'll say, look at the first 8 lines of the second coming. And so we're going to go through those lines now, not so much the rest of the poem. They're so important that we're even going to take the first few one by one. Turning and turning in the widening gyre. So that's the reference to the gyres we just talked about. As I said, they represent the transition from one age to the next, the connections between them. We have the idea here that history is cyclical, rather theological or progressive. So this is a very modernist idea. It's an anti-Christian idea. A Christian view of the world would be a theological view, with the world moving toward Christ's return and the new heavens, the new earth, the end of the fallen world, everyone who is saved being in the new heavens and the new earth. Yeats rejects that and instead sees history as cyclical. The second coming is about what I just talked about, the end of the world in the Christian Bible and Revelation when Christ's return. And so Yeats sees the end of the Christian age as imminent, but rather than the emergence of a new heavens and a new earth, instead he sees the beginning of yet another age that's very similar. History is repetitive. And so that's a very modern idea, in part because it's anti-Christian, and in part because it sees history as repetitive. And so that's a modernist idea because it's the pessimism, it's that things aren't necessarily going to get better, but you have this beautiful language depicting it. The next line. So, turning and turning in the widening gyre, the falcon cannot hear the falconer. Um, so the falcon flight path forms a gyre. So that's important. Again, the images movement. You can visualize this. That's an important symbol or image here. But there's a disconnect as the falcon is caught in the gyre, caught in the cycle of repetitive history. He can't hear the falconer. And so you have a disconnect, disjointedness. Human beings aren't communicating well. A failure to communicate really marks the modern period. You have people crowded together in urban sprawl, but they don't stop and talk to each other. They don't care what happens to each other. That's one of the problems of modernity. The falcon and falconer not hearing each other represents that disconnect, that failure to communicate. Turning and turning in the widening gyre, the falcon cannot hear the falconer. Things fall apart, the center cannot hold. So the world is fractured, as we've talked about. Things are falling apart. The center cannot hold. Long held beliefs are disappearing. So the foundational things we've always believed in, they're being shaken up by the social and technological changes of the modern world. We can't believe in them anymore. This is an apocalyptic vision, is what this poem is. And so when I read these first three lines, really what I envision through this image Yeats is creating is the ground just coming out from underneath people. There is no foundation for anyone to stand on anymore. And as I did not live in the early 20th century, I try to imagine what it would have felt like to live during World War One, to live during these sweeping changes. The ground being pulled out from underneath people, I think, is the best visual to depict that, to depict the modern condition. And I think that's what comes through in these first three lines of Yeats's poem. And that's why it's brilliant, at least for explaining the modern condition to people. So here you have, this is the only picture I could find of a falconer and a falcon not being together. It looks like they can clearly hear each other, but that'd be a hard picture to find. So moving on, let's look at the other 5 lines from that opening stanza. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. The blood-dimmed tide is loosed, and everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned. So these lines directly evoke the horror and bloodshed of World War One. These 3 lines are famous for transitioning from the 3 lines we just discussed that precede them. These 3 lines are famous for evoking World War One. And Yeats wrote this poem in 1919, just after the end of World War One. And so what do we see here? Purposelessness, wastefulness, disconnection, tragedy. These are things that mark the modern world, that again where World War One was emblematic of them, represented them, as we already talked about. And as I've said, Yeats uses beautiful language to depict something horrific, thus underscoring the cruelty and harshness of the modern world. So these are often quoted lines. You see, the blood-dimmed tide, the ceremony of innocence, mere anarchy. These are titles of episodes of TV shows and movies and books and things. Because when you just read it, if you just look at the language, it sounds beautiful. But it's depicting World War One. It's depicting one of the most horrific things ever. And so you have an irony here. What does that irony do or achieve? It underscores the cruelty and harshness of the modern world. The modern world is cruel and harsh. If we describe it in a beautiful way, that irony emphasizes even more how cruel and harsh it is. And we're not reading T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland because it's very long. T.S. Eliot was born in St. Louis, even though he became a British citizen, so you also read him in American literature surveys. He's a very popular author. You'll read a lot. Very important, though, so we probably should have. But his poem, The Wasteland, which is very long, depicts a modern wasteland. I think these 3 lines, just 3 lines, do a really good job of depicting a modern wasteland. Finally, the last 2 lines of this great opening stanza. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. So he reverses common assumptions here. He say the best lack all conviction. The worst are full of passionate intensity. We normally think having conviction, being passionate about something, is a good thing. So he's reversing common assumptions here. This is a common poetical technique of the modernist poets. Again, I come back to T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland, where you have the opening lines, April is the cruelest month. Again, flipping things on their head. April is usually the month associated with rejuvenation and the turn from the darkness of winter to the hope of spring. But Eliot says April is the cruelest month. Similarly here, Yeats says the best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. So that again, that idea of that feeling of the ground being pulled out from under you. Everything you knew or believed you can't hold on to because modernity has shaken it up. All right. So to recap here, Yeats's poem depicts a number of important aspects of modernity: cyclical history, failure to communicate, people now doubting long-held beliefs, unnecessary and purposeless violence, chaos, randomness, a general lack of feeling rooted in anything foundational. But it has that beautiful language. So these 5 things are modernity. And if you remember Dr. Flynn's definition of modernism, an aesthetic response to modernity, you have beautiful language describing these awful things. So despite its bleak subject matter, the poem contains beautiful language. This illustrates the modernist emphasis on art as the best response to these bleak conditions. So people like Yeats, Eliot, Pound, Joyce, Woolf, they would see a beauty in Yeats's language as we do. You can't not see the beauty. But they would argue that that beauty is what's most valuable about the poem, and that beauty helps them combat, grapple with, deal with these tragic things set before us here in the modern world. Points 1 through 5 there. I wanted to end by just kind of doing like a 1 bullet point overview of each of his other poems, since I assigned a number of his poems, but we don't have time to go through them all in the lecture. So as I mentioned, to recap, stanza 1, lines 1 through 8 of The Second Coming, provides the clearest and most succinct definition of modernism possible. We saw the transition from Victorianism to modernism with Hardy. I'm hoping now, through our study of The Second Coming, you're fully enmeshed in modernism and ready to just roll with our study of the 20th century. We didn't look at lines 9 through 22, the second stanza. It's only a 2-stanza, 22-line poem. But they depict the apocalypse that precedes Christ's return. So in the Bible, in Revelation, when Jesus Christ returns, before he returns, you basically have the end of the world. And because the world is fallen, following Genesis 3, what heaven actually is in Christianity, if you've studied the Bible and Revelation, it's not a bunch of white clouds. It's actually a garden, much like the original garden in Genesis 1 and 2, but not affected by sin. And so you have the new heavens and the new earth. So this world is essentially destroyed, so that the new heavens and the new earth, the new garden, can exist. And so Yeats sees the horror of World War I and other similar things in the modern world, and argues that that's the end of the world. It's apocalyptic. It's we're already experienced the apocalypse that precedes Christ's return. So Christ's return is imminent. But because Yeats isn't a Christian, Christ's return is not a good thing for him. And so this is just another indicator that history is repetitive, kind of the bleakness of modernity that can only be combated by the beauty of art. And so that's what's happening in lines 9 through 22, the second stanza of the poem, which are not as important to understanding modernism as the first stanza, the first 8 lines, but I wanted to cover in the lecture because they can be kind of confusing. I already explained this. Sometimes I get ahead of myself. I apologize, but Yeats isn't Christian, so this end of the Christian age is not hopeful. It's just the end of one age, a new one will begin. Two of the other poems I asked you to read, one is Easter 1916. So this is based on the real events we talked about in the previous part of the lecture of when the British soldiers repressed the Irish rebellion and executed 15 leaders. Yeats believed that his poetry had spurred some of those people to action. And some of those leaders executed were friends of his. And so it's a complicated poem that involves his own guilt. Um, but it gives good insight into what was going on with Ireland and Britain at the time. Finally, the other poem I assigned, Leda and the Swan. This, like many modern poems, is very difficult to read because it depicts a rape. Um, I had a student write a paper on it in a previous class of mine that I think was an absolutely brilliant paper and explains why Yeats wrote this poem, which has always been a hard poem for me to understand. But he uses very specific language, which is what makes it hard to read because it depicts a rape with very specific language. But it's retelling a story from Greek and Roman mythology. And what this student of mine did was actually look back at the story in Greek and Roman mythology. And what she found there was that the language there is used as it's very vague. And those were patriarchal cultures where women didn't have a lot of rights. And so she reads Leda and the Swan as a feminist poem by Yeats and argues that in depicting the retelling this story from Greek and Roman mythology, where it just kind of glosses over the fact that Zeus attacks this woman because in those cultures, Zeus is a god who can do whatever he wants. It gives this feminist kind of recasting of that where it doesn't hold back in showing the harshness and the brutality of rape and thus criticizes past cultures that may have glossed over it and makes the argument we cannot gloss over it. Abuses against women are real things that we have to confront. And so that reading of the poem, I think, makes it very powerful, even though it's a hard, challenging poem to read. So here's some insights on Yeats, and here's, I think, a really great introduction to the modern period. We're going to push on and look at Joyce.